All right, welcome everybody. My name is Michael Trujillo. I teach in the Visual Arts Department. And I want to first thank Cal IT2 and the gallery here at Cal IT2 for partnering with the Visual Arts Lecture Series to present Gail Wight here in this beautiful auditorium, and for working with Visual Arts Department to put on this event. And the food and the wine, it was really fun. I'm full of your amazing water, and it was delicious. And all the wine. I want to introduce Gail Wight. She's an associate professor at Stanford University, where she's been teaching since 2003. And she'll be talking about her work. Her work is, I think, very interesting and very resonant, especially in a space like Cal IT2, where so much imagination and sort of forward thinking about the intersection of technology and our actual lived lives and our imaginations kind of cross paths. And one of the things that I respect so much about Gail's work is that it engages with sort of these very interesting notions of science and technology and pharmacology and psychology, and also a huge amount of humor and a kind of lightness. And so when she maps our DNA, she may be literally mapping our DNA, or a mouse's DNA, but she's also kind of showing us where we are and where we are right now and where we've been in the last 100 years and where we may go. And in that way, her work reminds me of some great science fiction or experimental creative nonfiction, in the way that it is both, it's once very personal and on another level very sort of revelatory about our condition as technological beings, as psychological beings, as biological beings, the humor and compassion in particular. She's a great educator. I met Gail 10 years ago when I was at Mills College, where she was teaching at the time, in Oakland, California. And on a personal note, she's a very good friend and a really great human being. So I'm glad to introduce her, and Gail Wight, everybody.
Thank you, Michael. That was a very sweet introduction. Thanks. And thank you for being here this evening. I realize this is a very exciting and busy campus and city, so there are probably 1,000 other places you could be this evening. So thanks very much for being here. I'm going to start this evening with this image. This is not my work. You might have guessed. This is Hans Holbein. And this is the ambassadors. He painted this in 1533. I figured there were some students in the audience tonight, so I wanted to talk about this because I first saw this painting when I was a student. And it struck me, it really moved me, and it changed what I was doing as an artist. So one of his most famous paintings, primarily because of this anamorphic skull in the foreground. He painted this to be seen from a certain perspective in a stairwell. As you came up that stairwell, this anamorphic skull would sort of snap into perspective. But that wasn't the thing that really moved me about this. What I was interested in was all the stuff on the table between these two guys. It's a collection of objects, and it's a collection primarily of scientific instruments. So there's a terrestrial globe, a celestial globe, there's a quadrant, an astrolabe. There are a bunch of other astronomical and navigational instruments on here, a polyhedral sundial in there. All of these things really fascinated me because they spoke about a particular moment in time and its efforts to understand the world in a new way. It was a fresh way of understanding the world, and it was embodied by this painting. It was also embodied by these two ambassadors. So you've got these two gentlemen, one of them incredibly poofed out by his amazing attire, right? And he's kind of stepping out into the frame. And he's science, he's the future. He is the owner of these instruments. And the other gentleman is in more clerical dress. He's kind of stepped backward. He's a little more somber looking. And beneath them on the table here, there's a lute with a broken string. And this supposedly embodies the discordance between these two worlds. I felt like, okay, well, let me first just add a caveat to that. That's the standard reading of this painting. Of course, it's It's a 500-year-old painting. Art historians are busy people. There are 500 years of debate on how to read this painting. But that's kind of the standard story, and I like that one. I am interested about the discordance, and I'm kind of shocked by the discordance about science in my own time. And I really wanted to be able to do what Holbein was doing. I wanted to embody the science and the discourse around science in my time, because I'm kind of a nerd. I was really interested in this nerdy stuff, and I really wanted to talk about all these wonderful scientific discoveries of my time, but also the tragedies in there, the cultural artifacts in there, the pedagogy of science, and all of these different kind of twists in history and the paths not taken and that sort of thing. But I'm faced with these particular problems. One, I promise you I will never be the painter that Holbein was. Just can't do it. Very few could. Also, I'm super interested in new modes of visual language. I don't know that I believe that they'll ever totally supplant painting in the world of art, but I'm really interested in video and electronics and responsive objects. They are very ubiquitous in our culture. They're a very fluid medium, and so that was the stuff that I was interested in working in at the time and still. And then thirdly, as Michael mentioned, I have a very twisted sense of humor. There's no point in trying to keep that out of my work. It will just find its way in. If I try to keep it out, it will just become more and more embarrassing and horrid, so embrace it. Okay, so for the next 30, 35 minutes or so, what I'm going to do is take you in a very quick jaunt through about 7 or 8 works of art, and I'll talk about them fairly quickly to give you a sort of context and flavor of what I do. And then I'm going to spend a little more time talking about 5 pieces and the sort of research and background that went into them. And then I'll end with just a couple of images of a work in progress, because if there's nothing more artistically suicidal to do than show the work of art of Holbein at the start of one's own talk, the next most suicidal thing to do is show a work of art in progress, so why not? So, okay, so the first piece is Zookit. Zookit is 4 racks of test tubes. Each of these test tubes contains DNA. So there's the DNA of land animals, sea animals, animals of the air, and all of the flora to keep them alive. It's a bit of a tribute to Fluxus, who made a lot of kits to do all sorts of things. And in the center is the DNA for the zookeeper. So ostensibly, you could take this little kit anywhere and start your own zoo. This is a cabinet of curiosities. This particular image is of a touch screen, and it sits in a cabinet like this. And each of these objects, it's based on the natural history museums, very early science museums, but it's got both old objects and new objects. So there are shells and debris and that kind of thing.
I feel so strange. Help me! I'm cracking up. Help me! I feel so strange. Here I go again. I'm tearing apart.
Okay, cell division
Oh, no.
from the point of view of the
This
cell.
is terrible.
Each one of these has a kind of like anecdote of evolution behind it. Now, this is kind of a slot machine of genetics. Each one of these objects has some kind of quirky, nonsensical anecdote about where evolutionary theory has ended up at this point of time behind it. Let me just jump ahead in this video. This one is Chopin's Fugue, and you can kind of play this skeleton like the fugue. He's a little piano. I'll let this one run through. A little ode to Darwin. I showed this to someone and they said, man, those middle-aged years are rough. Tell me about it. so I'm going to move ahead on this. This was a piece done for Ars Electronica in Austria, which is a festival about technology. And in this year, it was the first year that they looked at biology. And they commissioned this piece. It's a history of how we came to think of ourselves as electrochemical, which to me seemed really essential. I'm guessing that not everyone here wakes up every morning worried about how did we come to perceive of ourselves as electrochemical, but to me it was a really big question. So in this maze there is Spike the rat, and he has free reign. I kind of want to give the rat, who is the embodiment of so much of this history, free reign. So there are 52 moments in here of ways in which we see that history. There's, oops, have I lost sound? Maybe I lost sound. That's a galvanic bath. People used to drop electrodes in and electrocute themselves. It started out with Plato. It came up with the concept of the brain as a seat of emotion, but also of eugenics. This is Pavlov's dog who would howl when the rat ran by. All these different moments. Electroshock therapy. In the back are experiments on the giant squid axon. He's running through cat vision experiments here, running over a sheet of LSD there. This is transgenic tomatoes and electroporesis thing. And Spike had the freedom to kind of eat this stuff, move it around, bring it back to his nest. When I set this up at the OCA Center at ours, the director said, I was setting up and he said, what are we going to do if what are you going to do? It's this very awkward moment. I didn't know what he was trying to say. And I said, what? He said, what are we going to do if the rat wee-wees? I said, oh my God, this rat is going to mess up this thing. Do not worry about that. That's minimal. This thing will be trashed by the time we're done. And indeed, but Spike did kind of rearrange and eat everything. It was kind of like a giving back moment for a test animal. That so inspired me in this kind of giving back moment that I thought mice, too, have kind of given a lot to scientific experimentation. So I made this Rodentia violoncello for the Summer Music Festival at the Lincoln Center in New York. And inside of here are 5 mice, and they, whenever they feel like it, are standing on these little whisker switches that play cello phrases. And so the frustration of this is normally, I think we think of mice as doing something and we're going to kind of get the reward of what they're doing. Well, or they learn something and we learn from their learning. But here, like, they just sleep when they want to sleep, play with music when they want to play. It's kind of up to them. It was so much fun to kind of deal with that turn of the tables that I ended up making this whole orchestra. And so there's a harp, the cello, a drum, a carillon, and the piano. They would all play the phrases of the music instruments that they belonged to, except for the drum, which had piezos in it. So they would just pick up the noise of the mouse's feet, and everything was highly amplified, so that would kind of go like, so you got a little noise music in there. And I had the option of either mixing them in 5 channels that would cancel each other out, so you'd get a kind of sequential sound as the cello played and then the piano, but I really wanted it to be the full cacophony. So if everything played at once, you heard everything at once. If the mice were sleeping, the mice were sleeping. So I'll play you just a little bit of that. And this is it. Can you hear that? Okay. I'm gonna hop through this a bit. I promise you there was absolutely no reason or sense to this piece. What was interesting to me was, despite the amount of text and interaction and stuff with people, the question, are they learning? Do they learn from each other? And I could even stand there and say, no, you know what, this is really about the mice just doing whatever they want to do. There's no setup here. There's no experiment. Then the response would be, but what are they learning? And I thought that was interesting in terms of our own training and kind of what we expect from science. And this is about our own training in a lot of sense, what we expect of other animals. What do they do for us, and how do we use them in the work that we do? Okay, this piece, The Meaning of Minuscule, was funded by the Center for Probing the Nanoscale. It's a great name for an institution. And they had some funding from the National Science Foundation, and what they wanted to do was, they were required, I think, to use part of that funding for a piece that would discuss the ethics of science. So in this piece, this is just a sample of 9 of the 18 databases that existed in the innards of this piece. On this screen, you would see images from one of those 18 databases at any one time. There are 2 dials on that microscope. They are the classic focus dials, but one of them would spin through that database of visuals, and the other dial would spin through snippets of science radio. And that science radio I edited very specifically to be meaningful to absolutely anything you might be looking at any time. So it was very ambiguous. So I'll let this run for a little bit. Actually, let me just jump.
Eating and degrading organic matter and growing new bacteria.
These cells can be coaxed into becoming any different type of tissue in the whole of the human body, because that's what they do.
This is a bit like a plug and a plug socket, and the cells literally plug themselves into the cell next door.
So the absence of is just as important as the presence of things.
Okay, so obviously I chose British Science Radio. I know that there are some people from the UK in the audience tonight, so for all of you, why did I choose British Science Radio? Because I have a good friend who said to me, Gail, it doesn't matter what I say to you because I have a British accent. I sound fucking brilliant. You'll believe anything I say. It's true. As an American, I feel really susceptible to that. And so I was like, okay, it's got to be British Science Radio. Okay, this piece, center of gravity. How to explain this? So this piece has to do with my looking at the present becoming the past. So these are light poles. They're about 8 feet long and 3 inches in diameter. And each one is constructed of a photograph of some place that's really important to me, some place I've spent a lot of time. And I have audio tracks from those spaces as well. Those places are changing. Are they changing because of climate change, global warming? I don't know. You know, there are jellyfish on the Northern California coast that weren't there a few years ago. But I can't say for sure, but I do see that my present environment is changing quickly. So I was trying to make my present become the past by turning them into core samples. And you would be able to walk underground. I wanted you to have this experience of walking underground through the present, and you would hear the soundtrack that went with them. So just for instance, I'll take you through a little clip of video. For instance, if you're up on the Northern California coast, you hear seals barking, but you also hear incessant lumber trucks coming down the coast. Or on the East Coast where I grew up, you would hear seagulls and waves lapping, but you hear airplanes constantly. So this is just a close-up of these. They have lights inside of them that are lit. And this piece is actually up, this piece is up at SF State in a show that will open a little bit later this month, in an ode show that's an homage to Steve Wilson, who sadly has passed away. But he's had a huge influence on me, so I'm happy to be a part of that. Let me jump ahead in this. Whoa! I didn't mean to jump ahead entirely. Okay. Okay, I'm going to move ahead. I debated about whether or not to show this piece this evening. This is a piece that I made during, and I decided I'm going to because I was trying to decide whether or not to put it in, and then two really important people left us this week due to suicide. This is a piece that I made in Australia at a residency at a place called Symbiotica. And Symbiotica is a very unusual residency program. It's inside of a school of medicine. And they bring artists in and they train you in kind of the lab techniques and ethical procedures of a typical med lab, and then you're free to kind of make work. So what I did was I made an artificial stomach, and a lot of my interest in science emerges out of, beside that painting, emerges out of a family history of thinking about illness and how science defines illness and how it has defined illness at certain points in time. So this is suicide from the stomach's point of view. And I was trying to find some beauty in that moment. How can we find some kind of redemptive beauty in that horrific act of suicide? The soundtrack is Darby Crash singing Sugar Sugar, and he is a victim of suicide. So I'll just pop into a couple of points of this. Yeah, or I thought I would. I'm going to finish that description. So I built this artificial stomach, and then I filled it with all the substances that people take to commit suicide. So you're seeing things like a bottle of aspirin, heavy psychopharmaceuticals. Because I was in Australia, eucalyptus oil, one of the things that people in Australia take to commit suicide, and other adventures. Okay, so I'm going to move into these next 5 pieces, a bit of a longer explanation of kind of the background of working on a project and what goes into that. This next piece is called Ground Plane. I have this fabulous working environment where I am around all these scientists. I have no idea what they're doing. And for me, the inspiration for a particular topic or issue in science has to do with someone I run into, a lab I walk into, an article I read in the paper, or something in a magazine. There's a lot of freedom and irresponsibility in there. But I happened to run into this woman at Stanford who's a paleobiologist, which I first had to learn how to pronounce, then figure out what that was. What are you doing? Your lab is really interesting. And she allowed me to come in and kind of hang out with her. Her name is Liz Hadley. This is her lab at Stanford. She's got a fabulous collection of bones and all kinds of stuff, and she does amazing things with her time. So she allowed me to come up with her to Mount Shasta and go on an excavation. So this is a cave that she works in. This is a grad student of hers putting tools together. And this is Liz in a cave. She said cave. I was thinking like, cave. This is a cave that was 18 inches tall. I will never, ever do this again. I'm kind of claustrophobic. But it was pretty extraordinary. Here's her grad student coming out of the cave that we were in. But it was very intense spending a couple days in there, especially in earthquake country, which after 20 years, I still feel like I'm acclimatizing to earthquake country. And then we went down to the river and washed through all this material. What we were looking at was wood rat middens. So wood rats tend to keep the same nest over thousands of years, and they bring tons and tons of material back to their nest. They're gatherers, whatever they can find. They're hoarders. And then you can go through that material and kind of figure out, as you dig down through those layers, what lived here when? What was the climate like? What were they eating as you go down through those layers? So that's what Liz was doing. And what she's actually doing is tracking climate change through small mammals, looking at what were these mammals eating and how dense were populations 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago. So this is her lab. This is a typical drawer in her lab. And if you think of a wall of these, there are about 20 drawers stacked this direction, and she's got about 6 of these cabinets, so well over 100 drawers, and each drawer is a collection like this. Now, this is not the collection from Mount Shasta. This is from another place. Liz went on sabbatical, and so generously, she just kind of handed me the keys to her lab and said, do whatever you want to do, which is incredibly generous, but also intimidating. Her grad student spent the year alongside me washing and collecting and, cataloging and going through all those specimens that they found at Mount Shasta and putting them into containers like this and logging them. This was an earlier dig that I went through, and I didn't know what to do with this stuff. I was thinking, I don't know what to do in this lab, but I'm perplexed by time. Liz talks about, well, that was 1,000 years ago, but then 10,000 years ago, there was this animal, and 5 minutes later, I'm like, so that was 1,000,000 years ago? No, Gal, that was 10,000 years ago. I'm like, okay. And then she'll say something about 10 million years ago, so I'll say, well, that was 10,000 years? No, Gal, 10 million years ago. And I'm thinking, oh, God, I can't remember what I ate for dinner last week. How are you, distinguishing between 10,000 and 10 million? It's so outside of my realm of human perception. How do you do that? So I was trying to sort through that, and I didn't know where to start, but I just figured, oh, you know what? I know how to take photographs. I'll just start photographing. So I started taking these out, and of course, each specimen has to be taken out individually. They all have a catalog number and a specific case and a place in the drawer. But I started taking these it doesn't look so hot up there right now, but I started taking these super high-res images of these. And you can see they're like the size of my thumb. These are squirrel jaws, mostly, a few marmot jaws, bits of snake bones, a few this, a few that. And when I realized I had over 1,000 photographs, and I wanted to start organizing them to make sense, I thought, how do I make sense of this stuff? So I started thinking about when I worked at the Exploratorium for a while, and they brought in some Tibetan monks who were making these big, beautiful sand paintings, and a few years later they came back and made butter paintings, and they were essentially organizing the universe. I thought, this is what I need to do. I need to organize the universe because I don't get it. I don't know how to think in 10,000, 20,000, a million, 10 million years. So I started thinking about these mandalas. When I started to lay out the bones and the shapes of these mandalas, they started to look like snowflakes to me. And I started thinking about snowflakes as these absolute crystalline structures that are also super ephemeral. One, and they're gone. So I was playing around with both the kind of octagonal shapes of the mandalas and the hexagonal shapes of the snowflakes. And so each of these images, they're about 44 inches square, are created with just one instance of each of those bones. So each of the bones in each of these images is unique. And I made a dozen of them in the end. Actually, I made 13, but I hated the 13th one, so I didn't print that one. So there are a dozen of these. And I was just trying to make, in the end, I don't know if it solved any problems or taught me anything, but it gave me a long and busy project on which to reflect about time. It did do one thing for me. It really altered the way I think about the ground when I step out. Kind of feel like I can feel time sort of receding beneath my feet as I step out. So this is a set of 12. They're fairly big. Okay, the next project is Hydraphilia, and this is an ode to the slime mold. And in this case, that's very dark. That is a bright yellow slime mold. I'm afraid to pick up my computer. It's very bright up here. Did you see that? The whole point of it is this is a super bright yellow mold that grows in Northern California out in the woods. You can find it anywhere. It grows on compost piles, but it's also the inspiration for the 1950s movie, The Blob. So I grew it in my kitchen, and I grew it on agar dishes, which is like a seaweed substance. But I tinted the agar with watercolor dyes, and then did a slow motion video on top of that slime mold growing. Slime mold loves oatmeal. This is actually the 4th or 5th piece that I'd done with slime mold, kind of a slime mold fanatic. It grows really prolifically. It's gotten out and climbed. I found it in my car. I found it on the stairs of my house, which upset my family. Not that I'm a bad housekeeper. Maybe I am. So I had stacks and stacks of this stuff. And then in this time lapse that I did of it, I'll show you a clip of it. Every 3 seconds of this video is 3 hours of growth. So inevitably I'd set my camera up here, and it's a microscopic camera. It's just trying to remember to get this right, 30 times magnification. So I would put an oatmeal here, put the camera here, hoping the slime mold would do this, and sometimes it would do that. And so I would, after 3 hours, I'd have nothing under the lens, very frustrating. So for 3 months, every 3 hours, I would go move that camera. And it was a summer of slavery to my camera. So 8 a.m. and 11, and then at 2, and then at 5, and then at 8, and then 11, then I'd go to bed. And if I was being really good, which I often was, especially toward the end of the project when I was panicking, I would set my alarm for 2, and then for 5, and then go back to bed and get up at 8 and start the ritual all over again. So me and slime mold. So this is, I ended up doing a 9-monitor piece of it, because at the end I did actually have quite a bit of footage. It's one of those things that we think of as this beautiful creature in nature, but we think of it as gross. I mean, think of its name. It's called slime. I mean, we have nothing nice to say about slime, right? Slimy. It's a derogatory term. But it is one of the most amazing creatures in nature, and it has all these fascinating aspects. It has no cell structure. It's just free plasma floating. You can watch its pulse going back and forth. But it has all these integral structures that look like brain growth and leaf growth, all these very cool things. Let me just jump through this a bit. So I just kind of wanted to make this thing that would ask people to look at the beauty of these things that are underfoot, especially after working with those bones. I want to just think about stuff that's underfoot that we perhaps don't pay attention to. Let this play for just a minute. Okay, if you're out in Nevada this spring, it will be at the Nevada Museum of Art. This is a piece called Restless Dust. This was a real pleasure for me because I have my whole art career really been fixated on video and technology, and I love sculpture and building stuff, and I love print technology, but I've bypassed it. I've never learned much about it, and I really wanted to learn about print technology. So this was an invitation from the San Francisco Center for the Book. They invite people to come for a residency, and they specifically invite people who know nothing about print. So I was a perfect candidate. I know nothing about print media. they bring an artist in and they say, what do you want to learn? And they train you on their equipment, and it's a fabulous program. Then they create a book and they sell that book, and that funds the next residency program. So it was a really nice thing to be involved in. So I wanted to do this Ode to Darwin. It was 2009. It was his 200th birthday, anniversary of the publication of Origin of the Species. I'd been to the Natural History Museum in London and was completely mortified by the comments there about Americans not believing in evolution. And so I was like, oh my God, to go home and do something about that. And then I ran across this quote by Mary Wollstonecraft, which I thought was incredibly beautiful around the same time. So I wanted to somehow bring those things together. So the book is about taking Darwin on a tour of the San Francisco Bay Area. And I was terrified to start with text, so I started with sculpture because that was easy for me. So I made these birds, which were Darwin's finches, and I put them in a box, and I lit them from within, so they have this little heartbeat happening from inside. And then I spent months persevering over the electronics and not going anywhere near the presses. And then finally they made me, Gail, you have to draw. So drawing backward on linoleum, I had Band-Aids on my hands for a couple months, very painful, and ended up printing this volume. And, I apologize. I thought I had brought some text from it with me, but I did not. The text of this book is I take Darwin around and we look at things that he would have loved in his own lifetime, the carnivorous plant nursery or the strange barnacles up at Salt Point, that kind of thing. We look at where genetics research has gone since his time. So we look at the giant DNA processing array at UC Berkeley. We look at the genetics data bank and the criminal genetics data bank. And cannabis clubs in the city and that kind of thing. And then we also look at the destruction that happened both in his time and in mine. So in Darwin's time, the coast was just rapaciously ripped of all of its lumber up and down the coast. And in our own time, and there's the story of Ishi at Berkeley as well, but in our own time, there's all kinds of stuff, mitten crabs being dumped out of the holds of Chinese ships coming into the bay, all kinds of non-indigenous species coming in and supplanting eucalyptus, all these things that we love, like the parrots of Telegraph Hill, not really supposed to be there, that kind of thing. So it's just a tour with him and playing around with ideas of biology and how I relate to it at this point in time. And then, of course, I become obsessed. These people are like, Gail, we can't handle working with you. Just take the keys and leave us alone. Because I want to do a fifth color, and I want to make postcards, and what about stamps? I really did like print technology. So this was a set of travel postcards and stamps that we made as a trade edition to go with this. Okay, so this piece is Kit. It came from an invitation to come to the Stonehenge archives, and out of the blue, which was kind of interesting. I had been interested in Stonehenge, but not necessarily obsessed by it, but I became obsessed. This was a fabulous residency. The best for students out there, if you're looking for residencies in the future, look for understaffed residencies, because they just hand you the keys. They have no one to guard you. So it was very British. They'd say, here's the keys, and of course we'll be back at 3 for tea. So fabulous. So I was playing in this room. This is how these archives were kept. It's Stonehenge. You'd think, my God, this is must be really... I was thinking of Liz's archive, right, with these little boxes and everything's numbered, but everything's just thrown in drawers. There's so much stuff from Stonehenge. It is not cataloged at all. It's just piles and piles of rock, and they're all tools. So I was really interested in this tool use stuff. So I'm sitting in this museum, and it is there was awesome stuff like this. I loved this. What was this about? I have no idea. There's absolutely nothing to go with this, but I thought, Christmas cards. Here's me loose in the archives. So this is a mammoth tooth. This is 1 molar. I was trying to compare and contrast. But I'm sitting at this museum, and it's across the street from the Salisbury Cathedral. So I'm an atheist. I'm in this place that's kind of a homage to science, right? But Stonehenge itself has all of this kind of mystical, religious, spiritual background around it. Most of the stories told about it are quite spiritual. But to me, one of the options of this residency was there was an archaeologist working there that summer. I could follow them around. So I followed them around for a few days. And their whole thing was, how did these rocks get here? Who made them? How did this happen? And so it was all about building. I mean, I looked over at Salisbury Cathedral and I thought the same thing. How did this thing get here? How the hell did they build that? They keep those arches up there. It must have been, how did they do this? When you look at costume dramas from, Europe, say 16th, 17th century, you never see anything in construction. But the whole place must have been in construction at some point, right? So, I'm just thinking, how did they build this? So I just wanted to make this homage to tools that would kind of play on this, the gorgeous kind of stained glass Victoriana stuff of this cathedral. So I ended up making this giant, it's a dark projection, so you can't quite see, or maybe it's just where I am. But behind here is an image of Stonehenge that I shot from a couple miles away. So these are all these hand tools that were used at Stonehenge or the village just outside. This is one of the skulls that they found inside of Stonehenge. And in the background is an image of Stonehenge that I took from a couple miles away. And I'm not sure if you can see this. I blew it up just as an experiment to see, maybe I should look for a high-res image to go in the background. And I thought, no, the low-res Stonehenge from 2 miles off looks very watery, kind of like a Turner-esque landscape, and it kind of fits with this landscape painting of, 17th, 1800s England. And then I realized there was a wedding happening here. You can rent Stonehenge. So there's a wedding happening in the middle of this, and there's a chain link fence that runs along. It's much easier to see in front of the original print. And then for those of you from the UK, you probably spotted this right off. The guy in the fluorescent vest off to the right, right? The cops are there, of course. So I thought there was this kind of great cultural mix of stuff happening. Maybe you can see the bride in the white dress she's just off to the center, off to the left of the center there. Okay. Last kind of focus on a piece here. This is a recent piece, and I haven't quite finished this, so this isn't a work in progress. This is called Solar Burn, and this has to do with these experiments that were done in the 40s, mid-40s, where this scientist fed drugs to spiders. I ran into this research in high school, and I didn't think about it for the next however many years that was, many decades later. For some reason, it kind of popped in my head recently, and I thought, I'm going to go look for those. What were those all about? This guy fed drugs to spiders, different things, caffeine, barbiturates, hallucinogenics, and then he had them spin webs and looked at what those webs look like. Now, we think of mice as and chimps and that sort of things as sort of the animals that are used in human pharmaceutical experimentations. So spiders, I don't know, I personally don't feel a lot of affinity to the spider state of being, right? And although I feel like an animal activist, I have stepped on spiders, I admit it. I don't do it on purpose, and I do try to free them when I'm brave, but I'm not always brave. And my studio is filled with them. I actually hold a grudge against spiders, I confess. So anyhow, not the point here. So he had these spider spinning webs, and when I went to look this up, I realized, oh my God, what am I thinking? The internet is covered with this stuff. These things are everywhere. There's like spoofs on this, So, but I really wanted to do something with them. So what I ended up doing was taking these big sheets of vellum. Oh, actually, I started out with smaller sheets of vellum. I did a series of studies that are done. So this one is benzodrine, which is a speed, and I gave it to the spider, and I burned this. I did the drawing and then burned the drawing out of the vellum using a magnifying glass out in the sun. So this is the last time I will see any of you because I'm going blind doing this piece. And this is the whole set of them. So there's caffeine, benzodrine, chloral hydrate, marijuana, LSD, and mescaline. And then I this is a close-up. I think I made I tried to do this on the plane on the way in. Okay, so this is a close-up. And I was trying to give you a sensation. When you hold these things up to the sun, you get this very sharp glare through those little tiny burns in there. And this is just trying to approximate it. But what happens is you get, it looks like dew sparkling on a web. I can't quite replicate what the sky does through there, but you get this very bright sunlight. So I'm now working on big 3x4 foot versions of these. There's an exhibit that's going to happen in the UC Botanical Gardens this coming spring. And if you're up in San Francisco or in Berkeley next Friday, there's a day-long symposium with Michael Fox and some other people around this exhibit. And then I tried to make you a little mock-up of what these will look like. So these will go up in the arid house windows there. They're very big. So you'll see the sun through those if you're inside. You'll get that sparkly image through there. Okay, so the very last thing I was going to talk about, I thought I would talk about this. This is a work in progress because it's right around the corner from here. This is a piece called Shell Game, and it's an exhibit that will happen in 2013 at the Beale Center, just north of here. The Burgess Shale, and I have very few images of this. The Burgess Shale is this amazing fossil deposit up in British Columbia. It's from 500 million years ago. This is one number I will have right for you. I had to write it down. The Precambrian explosion, an amazing amount of life that came into being. There are critters then that there are animals that have evolved from those precursor animals, those anatomies, but there are other things that have never existed since. So there are things that have never been seen since then, crazy things. They couldn't figure out which side were legs, up or down. They gave them names like hallucigenia because they were so crazy looking. So what I was thinking about was we are extracting all this shale to power our contemporary lifestyle. So in a sense, this was an amazing, one of the first major, it was the first major extinction that we know of. We're extracting these extinctions to kind of fuel our own extinction in a way. So the Beale is a place that focuses on technology, but I want to warn you that my focus on this is a very pathetic technology. On purpose, I'm building those critters very, very big. So these are just the models for them. And then I'm casting them in rice paper, so they're very fragile shell-like pieces in the end. They'll be lit from within, and they'll move around the space. I'm working with a Burgess Shale specialist at UC Irvine and an engineer from Irvine and also from up at Stanford. But the thing that we're focusing on is pathetic movement, that these things will die over the course of the exhibit. So this is my speed of technology. These things will slowly die, and what we're doing is hooking them into the data from shale extraction so that if shale extraction goes down, which is not likely in the near future, they will come to life a bit more. The lights will brighten, their movement will quicken. But as shale extraction goes up, which is more likely, they will have this kind of pathetic, Kafkaesque, dusty death during the exhibit. Okay, so that is it from me. Thanks for your patience. Are there questions? Do you want questions? I don't know what your time is. There time for questions, or I don't know. Yes. Okay. Yeah. This has been major for me because when I think about who I'd like my audience to be, it must include scientists because that's, I love hanging out with artists. They are my day-to-day. They're my life. But I want to have an intelligent conversation about this, and I can't do that on my own. I'm not a scientist, and so it has to resonate with scientists. So the first time I did this work, I was an undergrad at Mass College of Art, which is surrounded by hospitals, and I was absolutely terrified. was totally fucking terrified. I thought, this is it. I may never make art again. And the response from these people who came to this exhibit from the medical community was so positive. Probably wrongly so. It encouraged me on a path I never should have taken. But it was really positive, and that was great. So, like Liz Hadley at Stanford, the shocking part is she called me. She was like, "Oh, I see you do art about science. I really love art. Can you come talk to my student?" That was shocking to me. But it's important that, and then I say to her, "But I don't know what I'm doing," And she says, "Well, I'm not an artist, and this is how we do this." So that's important. I at no point do I claim to really understand the science well, but I do feel like it has to be deeply respectful and engaged in that discourse, or that conversation isn't going to work. Does that answer? Any other? Yeah. Say that again? Do I? Well, I do, but it's a childhood prejudice. So there's this big, well, it's not, I'm making it big. It's not really that big, but it's a trilobite type animal that looks a lot like a horseshoe crab. I grew up by the seashore and I have a real infatuation with horseshoe crabs, so I really like those. And initially I was trying to make it a hovercraft. I wanted it to go, kind of move around the space. I haven't given up on that. Everyone else has. That's my favorite. Do you have a favorite? No? They're all pretty amazing. Yeah.
Do you have any advice in regards to encouraging conversation with people in the scientific disciplines? Like how do you inspire and maintain productive discourse?
Yeah, so yes, I think I do actually have a lot of criticism about where science goes awry. And I want to talk about that, like the problems with science, right? This is difficult. This became especially difficult for me when there was this huge rise of anti-evolutionarism in the US. I don't know if that's really a word, but I shall use it. I do need to be, I think it's important to be respectful of people's life's work, though. You can't walk in and say, like, I think this is, this is wrong about what you're doing. And of course, scientists are really smart, a lot smarter than me. So they are a peer review field. And so their own self-criticisms are really great. So when I want to say, so, like, what about this animal experimentation thing? Isn't there something wrong in that picture? They are the best people to critique that. And so the best advice that I give myself constantly is, like, my own critique even is very naive, and to set my own critique aside and listen to their own self-critique, because it's usually pretty good, even though it doesn't get voiced, because they can't, because then they won't get their grants. You know what I mean? Or whatever. So, for instance, animal research does really bother me. And in talking to this woman at UC Berkeley, I just lightly posed that question, and she went like, "Whoa, it's so crazy and bad, you wouldn't believe it." She took me into the basements of animal research there, which I was not supposed to be in, to see things that I was never supposed to see. And then her own research was trying to find a non-invasive way to work with animals. So had I not, had I voiced my own opinion, that might never have happened. And so I think it's what artists do best, right? They're able to take in and translate, maybe, but that taking in part is sometimes hard when you're critical of something. But am I talking in circles, David? No. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the limitations of scientific method. Being someone who is sort of a professional creative person, and you're sort of engaging in, you're sort of coming from this respectful place of these are the experts doing all this stuff, people doing all this research, but their science is sort of, it is sort of limited into, you have to be able to do things over and over, you have to be able to
Yeah, well, again, it's not my thought. It comes from somebody in the field. One of the best ideas that I've heard in that critique. First of all, the part of doing something over and over again, we do that too as artists, right? You edit video over and over again. You use a certain blue in your painting over and over again, just try to get the feel and the use of it and whatever. But the problem of that is somewhere in the pedagogy of it, repeating things in a damaging way that doesn't necessarily need to be done. So there's an author, Jordan Smith, who writes about how that happens at the pedagogical level. And when you have living creatures in a lab that you experiment on, and you have too many creatures at the end of the day, and they go into a blender and then down the sink, that's not a good way to teach science. And so there are critiques about the pedagogy that are deep and meaningful in there that I think are really fabulous. Never have I encountered, with one exception, a kind of negativity about don't critique my field kind of thing from somebody. And the only time that did happen was with that microscope piece. They had funded that, and I had some prints that I wanted to show along with that microscope. It wasn't specifically in my grant. And I said, I have some leftover funding. Would it be okay if I printed these prints? And they're test tubes that I smashed and photographed. So there are hundreds of them. Smashed, photographed, smashed, photographed, smashed, photographed. And they all have these very individual traits. I said, can I print these? And they're like, well, describe the work to us, and we'll decide whether or not we want to fund it. So I described it. And they said, well, what is it about? So I said, well, it's about kind of the beauty and the horror of science. There's this magic of discovery. Each one's unique. It's beautiful. They look kind of like, astral bodies. But there's also danger. They're destructed. They're, damaged. And I got the angriest letter back saying, first of all, don't tell us what to think about your work. I'm thinking, wait a minute, you asked. And then they said, and there's nothing wrong or dangerous about science. And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. So that was the only kind of real kind of blind encounter I'd ever had there. And so I ended up saying, okay, you know what? I don't want the funding, but let's just talk about DDT. Somebody wanted to stop world hunger. That's a good motivation. Nothing wrong with that, but it went awry. And somewhere in there, we need to be able to critique how and why so it doesn't happen again. And if you just say there's nothing wrong with science, so, only once I've ever really encountered that. I think, again, I feel like scientists are really great self-critics, but in the pedagogy there, and that probably was somebody who, in that pedagogical structure who probably had some more learning to do. Does that make that? Anything else? Any other? Yeah. I really am an outsider. I mean, I really am an artist. There are many people in the art and science field, which is pretty big, who have a scientific background. I'm not one of those people. And there are people who have an arts background that really want to practice as scientists, and I don't want to practice as a scientist. So there are people who want to make scientific tools or work in labs alongside scientists in general, and I want to be an art outsider. I think I have a freer voice from that perspective. So I really am from that point, and I would prefer to stay there for what I want to do. Yeah. He liked it. Yeah. So NASA redid those experiments in 1995. Why? I mean, MK Ultra stuff was way over. I don't know why they did it, but they did. They redid it in 1995, and they got the same results. Yeah. Isn't that amazing? So I'll tell you a story. I ran across those in high school because in high school someone said to me, "Come on, Gail, do LSD." I was like, "No way. I'm not going to do that. I'm a good girl." And then I went and looked those up. I was like, hell yeah. Look at that web. My life would be a lot more ordered. So, yeah, it really happened. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. I don't know if they caught anything, but so, yes. Oh. Oh, no, it's a really silent thing, but that's a great comment. It's just silent. It's really quiet stuff. I didn't think of any sound, but I do love sound, so I'm going to take that home and think about it. That's great. Anything else? You've been a very patient audience. Thank you for the tip. Thank you.